another week where we can meet together even though we're apart and learn about God in his wonderful true word. And isn't it wonderful that his word is just as powerful while we're apart in separate homes as when we meet together physically in the church? So, before we start, I have a question for you about books and reading. So I don't know if any of you like books, if you like reading, maybe you've done a lot more reading while you've been in lockdown, and there might be different books that you really like and some that you don't like. And books, really, they are divided into two categories, aren't they? About stories that are made up stories and stories that are true stories. So I've got some books here and I want you to tell me, are they made up or are they true? So this first one is called The Yellow Fairy Book. So this is a book with lots and lots of different fairy tales in it. So things like The Emperor's New Clothes, The Golden Crab, The Glass Mountain. Maybe you're familiar with some of them, maybe not. These things, fairy stories that I used to read a lot. So what do we think? True or made up? Shout it out. Yeah, this is definitely made up. Fairy stories is the clue, isn't it? Okay, what about this one? This is another story that is based on a fairy tale. So it's called Beauty, and it's a retelling of the story of Beauty and the Beast. So Beauty meets a beast. He's really awful, but actually he's an enchanted prince, and he learns how to be good and how to love, and the curse is broken. So what do we think? True story, made up story? Yeah, this one's definitely another made up story, isn't it? Okay, what about this one? Millie Molly Mandy. Did anyone read this book when they were little? About a little girl, and she lives with her uncle, her aunt, her mum, her dad, her grandmother, her grandfather, all in a little cottage. True or made up story? Yeah, this one's another made up story about a girl in a village. Nice stories, but made up. And then this is maybe one for the adults. It's called Pride and Prejudice. Really good story about a family of girls about 200 years ago, a bit more than 200 years ago. So what do we think? Pride and Prejudice. Maybe your mum and dad could help you with this. True or made up? Yeah, this one is made up as well. They're all made up stories, aren't they? Okay, what about this one? This is called J. Hudson Taylor, A Man in Christ. All about Hudson Taylor, who when he was only 21 years old, sails away from England, never expecting to see his home or family again, to a strange land called China. This was quite a number of years ago. And by the time he died when he was 73, he travelled to China 11 times, telling people about Jesus. So what do we think? Do we think this one's a true story or a made up story? This one is a true story. It's what we sometimes call a biography. It's a story all about a real person and their real life. Now, why would we read stories like this? Well, it's because if we're interested in the real person, we're interested in the rest of their life, aren't we? So maybe you might have a favourite sporting star or a favourite actor or something like that, a comedian that you really like, and you're interested to find out more about them. You might want to know where they grew up, what their family was like, what sort of things they like, what their interests are. And if they did something really exciting, like Hudson Taylor sailing to China before really there were any Christians there, or a sports star who has broken all sorts of world records, we want to read about that real, true, exciting story. And it's even more amazing, isn't it? Because it's true. Fairy tales and stories set 200 years ago are fun, but there's something particularly special about true stories because we know they really happened. We know that what they're talking about is a wonderful thing that is true and powerful in some sort of way. Well, today we're going to be back looking at Paul, and we'll be back where we left off. He was in prison with Felix as governor. Felix has left and there's a new governor called Festus, and there's yet another trial. And at the trial, Paul takes the chance to tell the true story of how he became a Christian. So it's sometimes called a testimony. And the true story of how he became a Christian is a wonderful way for Paul to tell all the people that are there the gospel. So If you don't have a Bible with you, pause the video, run off and get one. We're going to be in Acts 25. Come back and we'll dive in with that story and that chapter. So I'll just pray before we start. Heavenly Father, we do pray that you'd help us to concentrate, to listen to you and your word, to learn more about you and to learn how to love you more. Amen. So we're in Acts chapters 25 and 26 this morning, and we left Paul last week, didn't we, in Caesarea. So he'd been a prisoner there for 2 years, and he'd been a prisoner there under someone called Felix, who was the governor, the kind of ruler of Judea and Samaria for the emperor. And he'd been there for 2 years, even though he'd done nothing wrong. He wasn't guilty of what he'd been accused of. But remember that God had told Paul that his mission wasn't finished yet, that God was going to send him to Rome to speak there, just like he'd been doing in all the other countries that he'd been in so far. So, Felix, the old governor, had left at the end of the 2 years, and we've now got a new governor of Judea and Samaria called Festus. Now, that means that Festus basically inherited this problem of what on earth to do with Paul. Felix hadn't wanted to get rid of him because he wasn't guilty, but he also didn't want to make the Jewish people cross and angry, and Festus had exactly the same problem. So he thought, well, they're asking me to send him to Jerusalem to be tried there. Maybe I should do that. But remember, there was this whole little group of people that were desperate to kill Paul. And they had made all sorts of promises about not eating, not drinking. And they were still keen to do it. So they wanted Paul to come to Jerusalem to be tried there, so that on the way they could kill him. And Paul, surprisingly, was a Roman citizen. And so that meant that as a Roman citizen, he was allowed to insist on a trial that involved the emperor, that he could go to Rome itself to be tried by the emperor. Now, this is what he was asking Festus to do. But Festus, having talked to Paul, realised that he had a problem. He couldn't work out anything that Paul had done wrong. And if he sent Paul to Rome, he'd need to send him with a list of charges, things. Paul is guilty of this, Paul is guilty of that. This is what you need to try him on the basis of. And if he sent Paul to a busy, powerful emperor of the whole of the Roman Empire with an empty charge list, that would not go very well for Festus. So he called up King Agrippa. Now, Agrippa was a bit like the puppet king, so he was the Jewish king of Samaria and Judea, but really he hadn't got much power. And he talked to him because he wanted to understand what it was that Paul had done wrong. Now, after they discussed it, Agrippa decided that he wanted to talk to Paul as well. He wanted to hear what it was that Paul had to say. So, this is where we're starting off today. So in chapter 25 we finish with Paul in front of Festus, the governor, and Agrippa, the king, and all the most important people in the city. Now this would be the opportunity, wouldn't it, for Paul to defend himself, to say, I'm not guilty of these charges. But instead, he does what he always does. He tells people the good news. He uses it as an opportunity to share the gospel. And in chapter 26 of the book Acts, he does this by sharing his testimony. So it's a bit like telling the story of what God has done in his life. It's a bit like a biography. So he did this by telling the true story about what Jesus and the good news had done to Paul and how that had changed him. So they could see how powerful Jesus was as the king and how wonderful the good news was and how much power it had to change lives. So let's look at that part of the Bible now.
King Agrippa, I will answer all the charges that the Jews make against me. I think it is a blessing that I can stand here before you today. I am very happy to talk to you because you know so much about all the Jewish customs and the things that Jews argue about. Please listen to me patiently. All the Jews know about my whole life. They know the way I lived from the beginning in my own country and then later in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time. If they want to, they can tell you that I was a good Pharisee. And now I'm on trial because I hope for a promise that God made to our ancestors. This is the promise that the 12 tribes of our people hope to receive. For this hope, the Jews serve God both day and night. My King, the Jews have accused me because I hope for this same promise. Why do any of you people think it is impossible for God to raise people from the dead? One time, the leading priests gave me permission and the power to go to Damascus. On the way there, at noon, I saw a light from heaven. The light was brighter than the sun. It flashed all around me and the men who were travelling with me. We all fell to the ground. Then I heard a voice speaking in the Jewish language. The voice said, "Saul, Saul, why are you doing these things against me? You're only hurting yourself by fighting me." I said, "Who are you, Lord?" The Lord said, "I am Jesus. I am the one you are trying to hurt. Stand up. I've chosen you to be my servant. You will tell these things that you've seen. I will not let your own people hurt you. I will keep you safe from the non-Jewish people too. These are the people I'm sending you to. I'll send you to open their eyes, that they might turn away from the darkness to the light. I'll send you that they may turn away from the power of Satan and turn instead to God." You see, God has changed my life. I'm not the same now as I was before. Before, I was a Pharisee, and I was a good Pharisee. The Pharisees obeyed the laws of the Jewish religion more carefully than anybody else. I thought that obeying the law was the way that I could be right with God. Before, I hated the Christians. The leading priests gave me the power to put many of them in jail. When they were being killed, I thought that was a good thing and I agreed with it. I often punished the Christians. I tried to make them say evil things about Jesus. I was so angry that I even travelled to other cities in other places to find them and to punish them. Before, I hated Jesus, and that meant that I hated God too. After, I'm different. I know that following Jesus as my King is the only way that I can be right with God. That people need to change their hearts and lives and turn to God. And the Lord has sent me to tell other people these things. I first told people in Damascus, and then on in Jerusalem and every part of Judea. And I also travelled to other countries in other parts of the world to tell non-Jewish people the good news about how their hearts and lives can be changed and turned to God. And that's what I'm doing now. With God's help, I'm standing here today and telling people what I've seen. Because before, I hated Jesus and I hated God, but now I love him.
So we've just heard Paul's testimony, his true story about what Jesus has done in his life, what a change that's made. And how did the people respond that were listening? So remember, we had Festus, Agrippa, and then a whole group of other men. So how did they respond? Well, Festus, the Roman, he actually thought that Paul was mad. He said, "Are you out of your mind? What are you talking about?" Agrippa was a little bit different. He knew that when Paul was talking about the Old Testament, about prophets, about Moses, that was reasonable, or at least he couldn't say that he was wrong about that. That was supposed to be something that he believed. But he told Paul that he hadn't persuaded him to become a Christian yet. But both Festus and Agrippa knew that Paul was innocent. They knew that they should let him go. But they couldn't, because Paul had appealed to Caesar, and so they couldn't let him go. Instead, they were going to have to send him to Rome. Now, if you trust in Jesus, then you have a story to tell as well. A story to tell about what Jesus has done in your life and what the gospel has changed. Now, it might not be as exciting, or it might not seem as exciting or dramatic as Paul's. Paul went from someone who was enemy number one of Jesus to telling everybody in the world about him. But Jesus has done remarkable things in every single life of someone who's a Christian. He's changed us completely. He's changed us from being dead to being alive, from being an enemy of God to being a child of God. You can't have bigger changes than that. And our friends might not be able to see Jesus in person, and so they might find it hard to believe in him because of that. But your friends can see you, and they can see what your life is like. And they can see what a difference the good news makes to you. So we can tell our story about what Jesus has done for us to our friends. And we can show that story in how we live, what we think, what we do every single day. What a difference Jesus as our King makes. So some people might not respond well, like Agrippa and Festus, but there will be some who will be curious and will want to find out more about who this King is and why he makes such a difference. So here are some questions for you to think about, maybe afterwards, maybe this week. So the first question is, have you come to trust Jesus as your King and as your Saviour for yourself? Is that something that you actually believe? Or is it just something that you think, oh, well, it's for my parents to believe? So do have a think about that. Is it a story that's personal for you? And if it is, how does trusting in Jesus, how does that make a difference to you? Day by day, week by week. How does it change the things you do or the things you think? And what is your story about your relationship with Jesus? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought, if I were to tell my story about what Jesus has done for me, what would it be? And have you ever told anyone that story? And maybe you could think about who you could share it with this week. You might think there's not much to tell your friends about at the moment when you see them, but you could tell them that most wonderful, incredible, true story about what Jesus has done in your life. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to share? And maybe you could ask your parents about it too. Have you ever asked them how they became a Christian? What a difference Jesus makes for them in their lives? Maybe that would be a really wonderful thing to talk about over to dinner together. So, God does wonderful, incredible things in every Christian's life. And it's a wonderful, powerful, true story that we can be sharing with people, to share the gospel with them. So why don't I pray now, ask for God's help, for courage to do that, and say thank you to him for the changes that he's made. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that if we trust you, you have made the biggest changes and differences in our lives. We thank you that that is a wonderful, incredible, true story about what you've done for us, just like what you did for Paul. And we do pray, Lord, that you'd help us to be brave and bold to share the true story with our friends about what you've done for us, and to show them with how we live what a difference it makes to be one of your children and your followers. In your heavenly name and your Son's name. Amen. Well, that is it for the lesson now. You should have some activity sheets to do and discuss afterwards. But after that, I shall see you next week. All right, bye-bye.